How long was I? How long was it?
He doesn't want to know. So what I want to do now is to bring the panel members up and to bring up Steve and David and have you all give you all a chance to comment and see if there are questions and comments in the panel discussion. Okay, so let me just ask either to start with either Steve or David to comment on anything you want to in the presentation.
Thank you. First, I don't think I disagree with anything Don had to say. I think he provided a great context for subsistence and talked about the cultural identity, the sharing, the networking. So I would not disagree with much of anything that he said. The things he asked for more of in the subsistence chapter, well, the first one was a unit of analysis from individual or household to extended family. First, I'll point out great studies by Mag Dance up in Northwest Alaska. I think came out 6 years after we started our subsistence study, so hindsight is great. 2002. Two was the first one, yeah. But the last parts of it, we looked at the indicators more. I mean, this is all a sharing network. We know that what Magdance did is document that in great detail of how that works. We knew, most social scientists knew that was going on. Way back in the 30-70 rule, 30% of the households or harvesters harvest 70% of the resources. And I think what Magdance did was really just document, delineate, and show how that worked and those relationships worked. As I explained, we already had 2 to 4 hour interviews, and we had to draw lines somewhere, and we really did not do a social network extended family analysis. And I think we'll take it under advisement to say, is that the way things should be done in the future, and not look at households and not look at individuals. And instead we chose indicators. So we did that Fish and Game gathered, and we knew that as the percent sharing, the percent giving, the percent receiving. And I remember when I worked on one of my first social indicators projects, it was with Dr. Frank Andrews from the University of Michigan, and I was struggling with the fact that we were only looking at certain things across the realm of subsistence. This was in the 1980s, and I was thinking, well, that doesn't capture it all. There's much as Don's discussion, that there's more to it than just those indicators. And he sat me down one day and said, look, when you're flying in an airplane and you have all those instruments sitting in front of you, you may have 50 instruments sitting there, but you really only need to look at 4 of them as you're going along, and you know that you're in the air, you're going forward, you're not going this way, and you're not going to crash. And he calls those indicators. So we kind of took that approach, and I don't mean to belittle the extended family. I think that's a great analysis, and I think we can take that under advisement how we could implement that in the future. But I still think the household measure and the individual measure is another valid way of looking at it. I think it's an add-on. Second was the underutilized data set, especially income data. I think that's true. We gathered a lot of information that Fish and Game has, we have, and now there's a pile of it there. ADF&G is done with their last report. We have a few more, and I think, did we look at all the data we gathered, and have we integrated it all? No, and that probably is a valid point. So that, again, comes at the next stage to me. What more do you do with the data that you have on hand? And then going to the TK, the community-based rules for conservation of resources and ethical basis for appropriate behavior towards resources. I concur, that's true as well. We did not focus on that. We just had long interviews. We knew that was also going on, and maybe we should have addressed that more, or at least documented and explained that. And then I would say that the underutilized data in the economics, that's been missing a long time to me. And I think Sharman made a career of going after the community-based coming up rather than looking at Department of Labor or census data. So I would concur with that has not happened. And I don't know that it's the regular socioeconomic person that does that, or the anthropologist that does that, or there's maybe another unique field there, a person that takes that and starts to integrate it. So I think that's all I have to say. David, do you have any comments?
I think Steve has really touched on a lot of what I wanted to mention, and we started this process back in 2005, and I ran into Jim Magdance, and of course we work for the same division. It's a very small division, so we interact quite often. And he showed me some of the things that he was doing with the social network analysis, and it's really quite incredible. It does take a significant amount of programming and analysis, and Jim is used to working with 1 or 2 communities at a time on his studies. He also, one thing I want to mention is that whenever you put a project like this together, you have to think about respondent fatigue and the amount of the survey length that you're going to do. These surveys that we did for this project are around 25 pages. The ones that Magdance administers are around 36 pages. They take an incredible amount of time. I have administered several of them. I've probably administered well over 100 surveys, if not several hundred surveys, in my 10 years with the Department of Fish and Game. And these surveys are just very extensive, but you have to cut somewhere, and one of the things that he does is just focus on major resources. And so he just kind of documents major resources. He maps major resources. He doesn't map everything. And we decided for the context of this project to really focus on all resources. Who's to say that those berries aren't important? Or why would we just focus on moose, for example? I mean, this is something that we felt was very important to make sure that we capture all resources. And that's what we focused on. And over time, over the last few years, Jim has really worked on this analysis, and I think it's gone much smoother. But by this time, we really had a methodology that we had been doing for a couple of years, so we just stuck with it. And we stuck with our survey form, the same antiquated survey form from the first project to the last, even though we had completely revamped it and in that period of time, and it was, it was out of date. But we wanted to make sure we had a consistent data set, consistent questions across 5 years of study. So, but a lot of the things that Don brought up, I think, are, looking at the analysis of the economic situation. That's incredibly important, and I really appreciate the work that he's done and going through these SPSS and really pulling in the raw data and doing some really fresh analysis with it. It's really quite incredible.
So let's see if there are any comments or questions from other panel members.
No, just one quick thing, not to make misapprehension what Steve said. If you do, as David said, add this sharing module, you still get the household and individual level. You don't give it up. You just take a lot more time, as he pointed out. So that the adding the social network perspective doesn't take away from your ability to analyze at the individual and household level also, which is important when you compare parameters from secondary sources like the census or Department of Labor and so forth. That'd be the only point I'd make.
And it might be a good, I can't see doing that across the board, but it might be picking a few resources in key case studies along with that. Would that do it for you, Don, or would it have to be?
Well, I think it'd have to be. My advice would be, of course, as you guys always do, work with the communities. It may be that you'd only want to do several core communities with respect to the social networks,
fair enough.
and use other communities and spend more time on some of the TEK ethical aspects and so forth. But it'd certainly be a negotiation between obviously the funding source, PLP in this case, yourself, subcontractors, and the communities and their representatives.
Okay, great, thank you. Other comments from panel?
Well, I think that we could take from the various comments that Don made in response to Steve and David's presentation and generalize a little bit from there. I think what we're all getting at, or attempting to get at, if I could have Don's permission to pull together some of the things he said and try to synthesize them, is we're trying to get at looking at the resilience and sustainability of these communities in the face of a whole variety of potential kinds of things that might occur to these communities. And I think that what that means is we look at the diversity of the suite of resources that have been identified that are traditionally taken as resources by the communities and ask, well, what does this mean? What does this mean if an individual community harvests a particular suite of resources, or a group of communities in particular harvests a particular suite of resources? What does that mean in terms of their ability to fall back on one or another resource if one or more should change in values as a result of any number of things that could happen? And in that light, I think you could look at the kind of networking analysis that Don was describing, that Jim McDonald has done and others have done in Fish and Game as reflecting one aspect of that. How does this kind of networking allow individuals, families, communities to respond to any kind of changes that might occur in the availability of different kinds of resources? And I actually see this whole second thing that Don mentioned, and that is the inability of Western science-based resource managers and Native communities to talk to each other rather than talking past each other in discussing some of these issues of mutual concern as a part of this. Because I actually think there is, and you pointed out that there looks like there's about 60% maybe potential area within there of some meeting of the minds. Doesn't mean it's happening, but I think that potentially it is there in looking at such, for example, theoretical positions within biology, such as optimal foraging kind of ideas, something that I tried to contribute way back in the 80s and discussing some of these kinds of things, because what that does is to look at behavior in terms of a kind of a cost-benefit analysis. So, for example, if the abundance of some particular resource like caribou or moose falls beyond a certain point, well, then maybe people begin to avoid taking that resource to the same degree and maybe move to some other area, or don't take that resource to quite the same degree, or take different age ranges of the resource or whatever. So maybe to some degree those kinds of ideas fall within or are characterized by various different spiritual concerns, or concerns about and the spirits or souls of animals yielding themselves up to people in the process of hunting. So, but whether you want to look at it from a kind of a cost-benefit analysis or from the analysis of spirituality, I think in many cases the behavior is the same. That is, when a suite of resources often becomes scarce, people tend to respond in certain sorts of ways. And if there is this kind of appreciation for those kinds of response mechanisms, and maybe there's at least a possibility there of people talking to each other rather than beyond each other and discussing, a possible suite of responses that have been and can be made when one resource is impacted, or one or more resources impacted. And this brings me to the final point that I wanted to make, and that is that, and I think Don pointed out that really the data are there in many ways in what's been presented in the baseline for doing a variety of different kinds of analysis that haven't been done that could be done. And one of the kinds of things that I would like to see done, and maybe it can't be done at this stage of things, but has to be done at a later stage, is running various kinds of simulation models that are related to these kinds of things. I've played around a lot with simulation models in the past and looking at different indigenous groups and their relationships to different suites of resources. I've done that in terms of marine mammals and that sort of thing. And I think that given these available data, there's information there that will allow running development of simulation models in which different impacts on potential resources could be assessed, looking at the whole diversity of resources that are taken and even integrating some of this kind of network analysis as a part of those kinds of simulation models. So maybe it's a little bit too early at this stage of things to do that, but I think eventually that could be a robust set of data that would allow, some better assessment of the resilience of communities in the face of, various different kinds of things that might occur to one or more resources given the diversity of resources that people are going after. So that's my final comment.
Okay, thanks. Steve, you want to comment on that, or you look like you were moving towards the mic?
No.
Okay. Go ahead, Chairman.
I also am very interested in the network data piece from the Fish and Game surveys. I don't think anyone's suggesting that Brond expand his methodology to pick up this stuff, because Fish and Game already does it. And thinking about what Don was saying, I was trying to imagine how we would use this information. Is it really just baseline description? Are we just talking about doing a network map for each community? Or are we going to use some kind of theoretical framework for thinking ahead what the indicator value is here, or how we're going to use it in a scenario modeling exercise to project impacts under different scenarios? And there are two bodies of work which may be useful here that I'm somewhat familiar with. Kofinas and Burnsilver have done some network analysis for North Slope communities, and I have not seen their research, and I've been begging them to come present it here. But it has something to do with sensitivity analysis to shocks in the resource harvest and sharing systems, and how the network, the community, adapts, and how resilient it is to different kinds of shocks, and having that kind of theoretical framework might give us an idea of, so is this really description that goes into the baseline, or is this an analytic tool for data that's already in the baseline that goes into the impact assessment for the EIS? And you have to think through what the impact assessment exercise might look like to be able to assess whether or not you're collecting all the right data. So it is worth going ahead and looking at a literature review to start thinking about these modeling exercises. The other hypothetical framework is one that I've dabbled with looking at Magdan's data, has to do with what do the network maps tell us about social cohesion or social fragmentation. Because I know from my work in water and sewer 20 years ago that communities that cooperate and work well together are more effective at solving their problems and adapting, whereas communities that have a lot of internal conflict spend a lot of energy pursuing the conflicts and often make less progress on solving their collective problems. And I've often wondered if this kind of network data can be used to graphically analyze, the structural foundations for cooperation or conflict. And one of the questions I have for these harvest surveys, I know that some of Magdan's surveys in the Northwest Arctic include network sharing questions beyond subsistence foods into things like cash and childcare and other kinds of household labor. Do the questionnaires in this region include any other network sharing questions beyond the food sharing that's in all the fish and game surveys pretty much?
I'll go ahead and answer that question. No, they do not. We just did the basic questions that we have is, did you use the resource? Did you attempt to harvest the resource? Did you give the resource away? And did you receive the resource? And so that's what we did at the household level.
I would like to suggest for future survey instruments that at minimum you include different forms of cash sharing, or you do ask about equipment sharing, though, I believe, correct?
Equipment sharing, no. We really haven't gone into this, and like I mentioned, a lot of MagDance's surveys are with one or two communities. They're very type of pointed surveys looking specifically at this social network analysis. And so if you want to collect all of that kind of data and you want to collect all the harvest data, you're looking at an extremely long survey form, and to do that in 18 communities is incredibly difficult to operationalize.
Yes, but just the cash and the equipment sharing are not that many additional questions. And I think that they add an incredibly valuable dimension to it because, as Dawn's graphic illustrated, these are complementary resources. And the pattern of sharing cash is very different than the pattern of share, and for that matter, the pattern of sharing equipment is different than the pattern of sharing food resources, and it tells us different things.
Let me interrupt the panel for a second. I want to get to Joshua, and then I really want to get to the public comments. Otherwise, we're going to run out of time. So, we also all are focused on the baseline studies, and rather than telling the state how to what information that they ought to collect. So, Joshua,
I'll be quick.
okay.
So, what I'd like to comment on is just in listening to the presentation today on the subsistence data and then comparing it to the information that was presented yesterday on the socioeconomic conditions and the richness of the subsistence information, and that it went beyond simply going ahead and noting that changes were occurring, but you go ahead and try to explain why those changes are occurring. And the socioeconomic chapter relied a lot on the 2000 census data, which fails Bronte & Associates' requirement for being current data. And so we're talking about current information, and it's not current. And so there's been a lot of discussion here about how you can sort of, I don't think it's reconciled, but how you can sort of join together the information that is collected in the harvest survey and then bring that back to the other socioeconomic conditions, and again looking at the regional economies as a system, so connecting all these sectors. The subsistence portion is obviously really, really critical, and then bringing that in to a systems approach and looking at how you can look at the other components of the economy. So I don't have any criticism, just a comment, and I really appreciated the information that was provided and the depth and detail. I thought it was great.
Okay, great.